As many of you know, there's a lot of concerns about the topic of deregulation. A little bit of background information on recent PHMSA deregulatory actions. PHMSA's considering a range of actions that might fall under the topic of deregulation, including modifying regulations, changing advisory bulletins and guidances and or making them available, changing the information they request from operators, and changing enforcement prioritization. The panelists may discuss different examples of deregulation, such as removal of class locations for gas transmission pipelines, pulling back on specific regulations, such as the carbon dioxide rule or leak detection and repair, changing the advisory bulletins, as I mentioned, reinterpretation and clarification of previously held positions, change in reporting thresholds. And I did realize I didn't introduce myself, so I'll do that right now. My name is Lois Epstein, kind of a nasty last name these days, but I'm a board member of the Pipeline Safety Trust, have been for a long time. My background is engineering. I'm a former LPAC member, and I now live in Anchorage, Alaska. So we've got some great speakers. I'll be asking one kickoff question of everyone. They'll be doing introductions and responding to the question for each of them, and hopefully we're planning on reserving enough time for some good Q&A. So I will begin with Alan Mayberry, and we've heard from Alan, former top official at PHMSA. So Alan, given your previous background, what is the likely impact of the new approach to regulation within PHMSA? And just as an example, does PHMSA have the staff needed to rewrite the rules?
Good morning, everyone. I'm the former Associate Administrator for Pipeline Safety, as Lois indicated, and I'm currently Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at JANA. I want to offer my disclaimer first that I'm not an employee of the government anymore, retired from government service. So my perspectives today are really from Alan and his experience in working with PHMSA for about 20 years, and the last 9 years as Associate Administrator. But, regulatory reform, deregulation, there are a number of names that have been used for it. It's nothing new. It's just, I know in the current administration, it's, there's a lot of banter around it, and I think you have to read through kind of the fog, if you will, and the discussion to really understand what it's really about. And as I indicated yesterday, if you were in the session in the morning, the way I viewed it and the way I handled it in previous administrations when we looked at reg reform, say under Trump 1, was it was really an opportunity to right-size the regulation. As a practitioner, as a writer of rules, as a professional overseeing pipeline safety, it was never about reducing safety, and that will never, I can tell you that will never be the intent of any actions to reduce safety and harm people. It's really about right-sizing and making sure resources are put where they're most effective. It's been called other things as well. Like I said, it's been called in a common phrase, and it's actually a requirement. It's called a retrospective regulatory review. It's kind of government jargon. It's just another way to say regulatory reform. But that was done actually under Trump 1. We called it reg reform. We didn't do it under Biden. There wasn't such an initiative, but it was done under the Clinton administration, under the Obama administration, what we call the retrospective regulatory review, where we and the agency went back and looked at changing certain regulations to make sure they made sense. It's also common with, say, information collection, occasionally the Office of Management and Budget that controls Actually, they really control policymaking in Washington, but they also control the information that an agency like PHMSA collects. And a lot of times over the years, there have been directives to kind of reduce that burden on the regulated industry, and just, so that's one other example. And that's just kind of in a nutshell, an intro to my perspective on that. Related to staffing, we'll see. Staffing's always been a subject for the Office of Pipeline Safety, and we're very appreciative for the Pipeline Safety Trust, the trade associations, to really influence Congress to give the agency more tools for recruiting and retention. And those are in place, so we'll see how those play out. But I want to mention two things. One, like I said yesterday, the inspection enforcement staff has really not been affected by any kind of reduction in force, if you will. In fact, there hasn't been a RIF at the agency, but there has been a loss of certain staff that's not related to inspection enforcement. And certainly that always has an impact, and the agency adjusts, I imagine. I can't speak for them, like I said, but typically, let's say if you lose an expert, I know a few have left that were in the rulemaking group, you pull from the field, you pull from other areas to bring in that expertise. It's just shifting of resources. But I do have, the team at PHMSA that does rulemaking is really good. John Gale is really good, but and John's leaving soon too, I think, and he's got a good bench of people behind him. So that, plus being able to bring in expertise from the fields, I think is how, I'd imagine it's how the agency would adjust. Talk further about that, but I think I've spoken long enough about these two topics.
Thanks, Ellen. Maybe if there's time, you could go into decisions made about whether something's mandatory or voluntary, which, you could argue it all pertains to safety, but it has differences. So I'm going to move on to Dave Chisla. I hope I pronounced it right. Dave's online, out of state, and he's representing NAPSR, which is the Organization of Pipeline Regulators. And Dave, if you can introduce yourself a little bit further, and then also answer the question of what are the different reactions you've seen or heard from the states based on this recent push toward the topic of deregulation. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm Dave Chesla. I am the manager of the gas safety program in Michigan, and also the immediate past chair of NAPSR that was referenced. I've been with the commission staff for 30 plus years, and also an immediate past member of the GPAC. With regards to the reactions by the states, I would say generally speaking, it's kind of been a cautious review of things that we believe the risk is low, and the benefits of some of the regulations may not be realized. So we've had a lot of internal discussions about specific areas of the regulations where we believe those risks to be low, and the potential for the changing of the regulations in some of those areas. And for those who've seen NAPSR's comments in the mandatory regulatory review docket, you know that we are generally speaking cautiously approaching any effort to deregulate. The safety standards are written as a minimum set of safety standards, and a lot of those standards have historically been written based on past incidents or other important issues that the industry has seen and desired and wanted a regulation to specifically address those issues.
Dave, can you give any examples that might help clarify what states are doing?
Can you ask the question again?
Can you give any examples? You talked about low risk types of regulations, perhaps, or low risk things that might change. Can you give an example of whether a state is making its own deregulatory decision, or somehow how the states might be providing input to the federal government?
Certainly. So some of the areas where we felt that there was the potential to maybe deregulate, and this could be specifically in the regulations and or in some of the interpretations related to the regulations, primarily related to small operators, small master meter operators, small LP operators, who may be running, a very small system with less than 100 customers, and the risks associated with those systems are very low. So having those operators follow all the same prescriptive and performance requirements of large operators may not be necessary. On the flip side to that, and I think Bill alluded to this in his opening comments this morning, when you talk about issues like leak survey, leak investigation, and leak repair, there are a lot of things going on across many different states. He mentioned the program in New York with the inside methane detectors. I mean, that's probably the Cadillac of programs. And I think we, as states, would all like to see that. But there is significant cost that comes with something like that. And then on the alternative, you see Nevada, who implemented a very simple set of rules where they now require annual leak survey on all the assets. Very simple, straightforward, but a huge benefit to safety at a significantly less cost. So, and there's other states like Colorado that Bill mentioned this morning that's working on their own set of leak survey and repair regulations. So I think, states are trying to balance, both where there are, less benefits from the regulation to something where there are definitely more benefits to having additional regulations like leak survey and repair criteria.
And are you at all concerned that some of the federal changes might affect safety?
Certainly. I mean, I think there's always that possibility. So, reviewing from a state perspective, providing feedback and comments during those rulemaking proceedings, I think is important so that PHMSA understands and knows, what the state's perspectives are. Also, states have historically had seats at the table with the LPAC and the GPAC, and so providing that feedback also during those committee meetings is important.
Great, thank you. So now we'll move on to Ashlyn Bolliker. Again, I'm hoping I pronounced it correctly. So please introduce yourself, and if you could speak to how your work might interface with this federal effort.
Absolutely. Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Ashlyn Bolliker, pronounced it correctly, thank you. With INGA, that's the Interstate Natural Gas Association of America. We're a trade association representing the vast majority of gas transmission pipelines in the US and Canada. And our members also have underground storage and LNG assets as well. This is actually a new role for me. I came here to INGA from PHMSA back in May. There I was writing rules that govern this industry, and I think that gives me a really interesting perspective from both sides of the table on this panel. So really excited about my new role, and speaking about modernization, it really echoes a lot of what Alan had said earlier, where this deregulation has truly sometimes can become a buzzword for this administration. And a lot of times it's taken on a connotation of, a wholesale culling of Part 192. However, I think when we've really looked at everything that's come out of the agency thus far, it's really been a modernization effort. Reading through all of the preambles of all of the AMPRMs, the agency has consistently signaled to us that they're really looking to reduce redundancies, outdated prescriptive regulations, and actually try to expand safety through those risk-based frameworks. I think we talked about that on the first day. All of this is really aimed at trying to reduce cost of compliance, but also without compromising safety. I think we're really always focused on resources and costs in order to make sure we're distributing those correctly. It's interesting to see the poll right before this about what are some of the biggest barriers to advancing pipeline safety, and the top of the poll was cost and resources, right? And I think that that's really what this effort has been about. Second, just point of clarity, like the INGA and other associations, I don't think that we've promoted like the removal of class location at any point. I think we've been looking at advocating for modernizing it. This is an extremely old framework that I think as old as some of those pipelines in the ground themselves, and hasn't really been addressed yet. And there's, as you've seen from William Mojica's presentation with Pipeline SMS, there's a lot we can do, even incorporating new technologies to make that program a lot safer.
I'll ask a similar question. Are you at all concerned that deregulation could impact safety?
I think deregulation and regulation, again, to us, I think it's really been more of a modernization effort. But I think anytime that you move the dial in either direction, there's a potential impact for clarity, which could impact safety. For instance, you could have a rule that is redundant or poorly written, and that regulatory piece, could then be impacting clarity and safety. Likewise, like removing too much is a potential for impacting safety and clarity. So I think that, we should all be using caution, anytime that there's a rule change in any direction. But overall, I have confidence that at least, amongst our members, right, that we're just going to be continuing to improve safety, regardless of the way that the winds go.
And is there any concern on your part about advisory bulletins and guidances being in flux, being removed from the site, clarity for operators? What's going on?
So I haven't seen them be removed from the PHMSA website, or I don't know if an advisory bulletin, I think they typically just go out through the Federal Register notices, but I think the first advisory bulletin that the agency put through was actually promoting pipeline safety management systems. Like that was, right out the gate, something that the administration said that they wanted to prioritize. In terms of, I think you're referring to, they removed an advisory bulletin regarding Section 114 of the Pipes Act that was implementing or adding additional sort of guidance or commentary around a self-executing provision in the Pipes Act. So I think that that's up to the agency's discretion. I don't know if that guidance has been quite as important as legislation or rulemakings.
Okay, thank you. So we'll move on to Hannah Vizcara. Hannah, if you could tell us a little bit about your background on your organization and also how your work interfaces with the topic.
Hi, everyone. Hannah Vizcara. I'm an attorney with a legal advocacy organization called Earth Justice. We represent other organizations, communities, individuals all across the country in a whole host of environmental and energy-related contexts. My work focuses on the federal level, on rulemaking and litigation around it, the development of strong standards, and defense of those, and again, through a legal advocacy lens. And with regard to PHMSA, where I intersect there is my primary work over the last few years has been around things like the leak detection rule, the CO2 pipeline rule, the LNG facilities rule, all of which are still in process to some degree or not. And so, that's kind of where my perspective comes. But I also will, more broadly work across agencies, EPA, I've had work at SEC, I have work all over the federal government. And so I'm also looking at this deregulatory effort across the government as a whole, and as well as changes in administrative law that impact how stakeholders interface with the government on rulemaking and how courts consider these actions. So I'm sure, talk about that in a minute.
Okay. Maybe you can elaborate on how the differing types of deregulatory actions can affect the legal landscape as it's in terms of how it will affect advocacy on safety and environmental protection.
Yes, absolutely. So, as you heard, there's regular reviews within agencies to consider right-sizing, modernizing, updating regulations, and that's all a good thing in general. I think what we're seeing now more broadly from this administration is a heavier emphasis on reduction of regulation and a true sort of cutting regulation. How that plays out in each agency can be very different. It may, one piece is what you've heard some about, which is sort of what's coming out so far from the agency. Another piece to consider is what's not coming out from the agency. So the CO2 pipeline rule was proposed at the end of the last administration and then pulled back by this administration. There's now no date on the Pipes Act web chart about when they're going to, no dates around when the agency intends to revive that effort, propose something new, or revise that proposal. Same with the leak detection rule. That was a rule that PHMSA had worked extremely hard on over many, many years, with a lot of input from stakeholders that had gone through the advisory committees, and they released the final rule at the very end of the last administration. It wasn't published in the Federal Register. That also was pulled back. That also right now has no estimated timeline listed on the website for when they're going to address that. Those are both things that are statutorily required, that have congressional directives for the agency to address. So they have to at some point. So that's another piece of this deregulatory effort. I'll also just note that, we have seen, so deregulation is regulation from a process standpoint. Rulemaking is rulemaking. You have to go through the administrative, you have to comply with the Administrative Procedure Act, you have to issue proposals, you have to take comment. So the process generally takes the same kind of time and effort. And what we are seeing right now across the government as a whole is a lot of emphasis on speed and on breadth of deregulation, and that has led many agencies to figure out ways or attempt shortcuts through this process. A lot more direct or interim final rules, presidential exemptions from regulations, or extension of compliance deadlines, and even a lot less reliance on the inherent knowledge and expertise of the civil service within agencies, and a heavier reliance on political staff in rulemaking and in developing the rules. And I'm speaking with those comments. I'm speaking more broadly across the government, not specifically to PHMSA, although we are seeing some of that there too. And those all bring with them potential legal pitfalls. The agency potentially puts its proposals at risk by doing some of that, and I think that's where you see some of that influence of this really strong deregulatory directive from the White House potentially interfering with the type of modernization efforts that you would want to see from an agency. And I'll just, one last piece, because I don't want to take up too much time, is this is also overlaid with a big shift in administrative law and how the courts review challenges to regulatory actions, to agency actions. For decades, we've had a sort of judicial review rule called the Chevron deference, where the court looks at an agency action and says, is the statute ambiguous or clear about what the agency is supposed to do here? If it's not unambiguous, did the agency do it? Yes or no? If it's ambiguous, there was quite a bit of deference given to agencies in how they interpreted that statutory language. And so it allowed for flexibility within agencies to adjust as things changed over time. And the court then looked at, is it reasonable? Is it a reasonable interpretation of that statutory language? Not, is it the best or the only? Oh, wait, if it was the only, it would be unambiguous. But not, is it the best? Is it reasonable? And so that allowed for policy shifts, that allowed for expertise and technical developments to be integrated into how agencies did their work. There's been a series of court cases in the last few years that have changed that, starting with a 2022 case that sort of formalized the major questions doctrine and created an off-ramp to that analysis from the courts. And we can maybe talk about that in question and answer, not get into it here. And then an explicit overrule of that deferential process on the courts for the courts last year in a case called Loper-Bright. So now, when courts are presented with a challenge to an agency rulemaking or other agency action, they're not asking, did that agency make a reasonable interpretation of a potentially ambiguous statutory language? If it's ambiguous, they're asking themselves, what is the best reading of this statute, and not giving that deference to agencies. And what we're seeing in rulemaking proposals is that there's a lot of momentum around utilizing these new judicial precedents to try to reopen past regulatory approaches with the idea that maybe the courts would look at them differently now, so we need to change, or it gives an opportunity for a pretty dramatic shift from prior approaches in the regulatory space. I think that there's some potential for that also to be quite risky from an agency perspective. You're asking the court's going to be assessing what your interpretation is, and the big shifts from prior approaches and long history of interpretation of language are now going to be left in the hands of the courts to make a decision about whether that's the best reading of that statute or not. If we get into this later, we can talk more about what that actually means for rulemaking. But there's a lot of change happening right now, and there's a broader context to this deregulatory effort than sort of the narrower technical aspect of what PHMSA may want to do in the civil staff.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go back to the narrower aspect of this and ask Alan another question. And if you could put on your I'm no longer at PHMSA hat and maybe give the audience a sense of what it means to move something, as I mentioned earlier, from a mandatory measure to a voluntary measure. And Hannah just gave us the examples of rules that the agency has worked on for quite a long time or are legally required to promulgate, and perhaps they're being put aside for a number of years at this point. What does that mean? How does it feel to be someone who is working at PHMSA, perhaps, or if you could project that?
I might need you to clarify moving from mandatory to voluntary, but because we work within the continuum of performance-based to prescription, and Gary Kinney, said it appropriately yesterday using surgical terms. At PHMSA, we like to say often we're threading a needle to dial it in because there's so many complex issues to deal with. But when we talk about reg reform, we're really not shifting, unless you're thinking of an example I haven't thought of making something that's currently mandatory, taking it out, and now just do it if you want. It did, where we've dealt with that issue is, say, with reference standards. When we first issued the underground gas storage rule, and we adopted the standard for underground storage. We said, okay, every should word in that standard will be shall, and you have to comply with it. And that didn't work well because there were some shoulds in there about how you use contractor resources that we were forcing people to do. So we had to retract that provision, and that was a case where we had an unintended consequence of doing that. But the expectation, and we're as the we've said a lot, is words matter, and if there's a word like should in the code, it means that okay, you do it if it applies. If you don't do it, you need to justify it. So, is that what you were driving at?
Yeah. Also, as you know, there is discussion about whether SMS, the safety management system, should be mandatory or not. Now, that's not a change with this administration, but having that kind of robust discussion, about the potential benefits for something to be required versus something to be recommended.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. The focus on SMS, and William brought up a great example earlier about aviation, which the agency also looked to, as well as the medical community and nuclear, as far as our approach to SMS. And it was really about, in the focus, and you've heard this, we didn't initially, when I was there, want to make it a federal minimum standard. You'll hear time and time again, we drive it, and everyone knows this. Part 192 for the gas code or 195 for the liquid code, it's a minimum standard. And we didn't want it initially, at least out of the gate, to be just relegated to a federal minimum standard. That is a negotiated outcome, and through that process of deliberation with all the stakeholders, it really minimizes it. So we initially, as we were promoting and as the standard was developed, we were cheerleaders in really promoting the adoption of it. So yes, it was voluntary. It wasn't incorporated by reference into the code, but the thought was that only then could we really realize the true potential rather than relegating it to a minimum federal standard. So fast forward to today, we had, the agency had issued a study on the adoption of SMS. Clearly, it shows some of the smaller operators are non or late adopters or haven't really bought into it. So that's one piece of information. There's still a journey for the larger operators. Many have adopted it. I mean, it looks promising, but the smaller ones in particular are a problem area with that. And that's where I think the new standard for 1173 that addresses more of the smaller operators, I'd like to see how that is adopted and embodied and implemented. But at some point, and perhaps we're there today, but maybe there should be some requirement for a framework. But being very careful not to make it just dumbed down to a minimum standard, because you really, really don't want to inhibit innovation, inhibit creativity, and control the the success of a program like that, which is really designed not to be a thing, not a regulation, do this, do that. It's a way of life. It's a way of, underpinned by a strong culture. And it's just something that's embodied by, a company with their people, with thinking about what can happen next, what could happen, rather than waiting and reacting to yesterday's accident. Similar to how, the other example William used, and we've used it before too, the use of seatbelts. It's a habit now. It just seems abnormal if you move a car without a seatbelt on. That too, with SMS underpinned by safety culture, is so important to embody that thinking, that process into a company.
So any quick comments you can make about rules that, like the leak detection and repair rule that was worked on by PHMSA staff? It got, almost to the end zone and is now nowhere.
Well, I too was disappointed that it was pulled back. A lot of work went into it, and starting with the public meeting we had, in early 2021, and got a lot of public input. It was a rule that was based on collaboration among all stakeholders that ended up in the 2020 Pipes Act to address methane leaks in natural gas systems. The outcome, the final rule, had gone through the GPAC process, almost 2 long weeks. There seemed to be buy-in at all levels, but but it still remains a mandate. It's not done. It got pulled back, but it's not going away, so it will have to be issued at some point.
Okay, thanks. So now I'm going to ask 2 related questions to each of the panelists, and after that we'll move to questions from the audience. What is your perception of the impact of deregulatory actions on the public and pipeline safety overall? And can we all agree that deregulatory actions should not impact safety? And I'm going to start with Dave.
Certainly, to answer the latter question first, deregulation should not impact public safety in any way, shape, or form. I think it's a matter of trying to, manage the risks and do that in the most effective and cost way possible. So I personally don't see that having major impacts on public safety. I think it's just a matter of redirecting priorities, and the higher risk priorities take precedence, and those are the things that are completed. And like I mentioned before, states are doing their own thing. We've seen one state recently that has gone through all the other states' regulations and looked at those and pulled the best from each of the other states and incorporated that into their own regulations. And states are doing that with industry guidelines too. So I would say states are looking at it from a holistic approach and trying to find the best path forward and continue to advance regulations, and not necessarily just focused on deregulating. Additionally, Masood kind of alluded to this on yesterday, related to states' involvement in rate cases. And, a lot of states are involved in things beyond just the pipeline safety regulation, and things that are advancing pipeline safety beyond what the regulations can do. A lot of states are mandating main replacement, service replacement programs, and those things are advancing pipeline safety more than what could be done with any specific set of regulations. I think in the last session this morning, we heard about the necessity of valves in the transmission system. And I can tell you from our perspective here in Michigan, we have definitely supported that with our 2 large transmission operators in the state. One has already installed 180 valves in their 2,500 miles of pipe, and including way beyond what the requirements of the regulations are. And we've done that work through support of the pipeline operators in our rate cases. And, our second largest operator from a transmission perspective is also doing a similar type of program. So we can have impacts on pipeline safety from a state perspective that are beyond just new regulations.
Thank you. Ashlyn.
So I'll definitely echo all of those comments, and just, obviously deregulation in this topic makes a lot of people nervous. So that's one impact. And I think, though, the agency's done a really good job of increasing transparency as they're doing that, right? Like, we've got a new interpretations process on their website that the public can comment on, right? They've started to take a shift towards publishing advance notice of proposed rulemakings that's another bite at the apple for both the public and for operators, right? So I think there's some optimism there about how much everyone can be at the table and how much transparency that the agency is allowing in this process. I'll also note that of the 50 some odd items that they've published in the Federal Register, a large bulk of those have been updates to technical standards that have been severely outdated for a very long time. So I think there's at least 10 that come top of mind, and I think all of those are going to continue to advance safety.
Thank you. Hannah.
Well, I think all of us across the table will agree that we wouldn't want to see deregulatory efforts impact safety. Whether our interpretation of those actions and whether they actually do that may differ. I think it's still quite uncertain what the impact of this deregulatory agenda will be at PHMSA specifically. They've put out a call, and I appreciate the ANPRM efforts and they've put out an ANPRM requesting comment on what kinds of things they might want to look at. But at the same time, they're also de-emphasizing statutory mandates to address known gaps in regulation. And the CO2 rule and leak detection rule are a significant piece there. And that's concerning from a safety perspective. And there, more broadly, again, uncertainty, because a lot of this is still in early days of PHMSA. There's been some technical updates, but the sort of broad breadth of what deregulation looks like there is, we just don't know yet. And in the first Trump administration and across agencies in this administration who are already further along in some of their deregulatory efforts, we've seen a real emphasis on reinterpreting legal authorities through rulemaking to limit an agency's own authority, which has traditionally not been sort of how agencies like to view what they could and couldn't do. I don't know if that's where things are going to go at PHMSA, but it is where things have gone in some other agencies. And I think that's quite concerning, because if the agency is proactively trying to limit its own authority to regulate, it also will limit what kinds of actions it can take from a safety and environmental perspective.
Thanks. And last, Alan.
Well, the safety is paramount. PHMSA is a safety agency. I would caveat that the deregulatory effort or the regulatory reform effort must not happen at the expense of mandates that are already there for gaps in the regulations, such as LNG. And I think it's been acknowledged that is very important. But we need to remember that while we're doing this regulatory reform, we've got some very important mandates, like LNG, like gaseous CO2, like leak detection and repair, that really need to be addressed. In 4 years, and if I were at PHMSA, I would remind my political leader that 4 years are very short, and we need to focus and accomplish things. And I will say this, under Trump 1, and I was there as a career lead, we got a lot done. We did reg reform, had a number of miscellaneous items that added flexibility for the gas reg reform. They're relatively minor items, I would say, but they added flexibility on and it made sense, a lot of it. But we also, issued the gas transmission rule, REN 1, proposed a hazardous liquid rule and the valve rule. And so there was a lot done, and we just can't lose sight of that. While we're doing reg reform, we need to do the stuff that's mandated, because that was mandated because there was a safety issue. And if those aren't done too, or if we don't make progress on that as well, then safety is not served well.
Good final comments. So I'm told we could go a little bit beyond the session time, so now we'll start taking questions from the audience. And I assume somebody's got a mic, or is getting a mic. They're coming.
I have a question for Dave Chisla. I'm a member of NAPSR as well, but you have been in the leadership over the last year. And I know a couple of the committees that I'm on, we stopped meeting. I think in one case, PHMSA wasn't allowed to attend one of our meetings. And I just wondered if you could kind of explain a little bit about the relationship recently with PHMSA and the states.
Thanks for the question, Matt. Certainly, when there's a change in leadership within the organization, there's a need for folks to get to know each other, get comfortable with each other, and be able to move forward with priorities and an agenda. And certainly, we had some of that, with our organization in PHMSA initially. I personally known Linda Doherty for 30 plus years, one of the first PHMSA inspectors that I ever met when I started with the state. So we definitely have had a long-term relationship and have maintained communications throughout the course of the year. Specific to now, though, we definitely have a better path forward. We recently had our national meeting, had PHMSA leadership at the national meeting. We're able to talk to them, both have them present at the meeting, and then ultimately have some conversations with the leadership, two one-on-one. So that's definitely improved over the last several months. Now that everybody's getting to know each other and aligning with priorities and agendas. And we recently had another meeting just last week with the leadership also. So we're going to continue to foster those relationships and the partnership with PHMSA as we move forward.
So I have a specific question about the role that DOGE may or may not have played at PHMSA. I had a very brief 30-second conversation with Alan already about this and his colleague, but just a little bit more detail. And I just need to preface that I'm influenced by my brother. My brother was the #1 non-political appointee at Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. So that's Obamacare. Big target. DOGE came in, and he had a great relationship with the folks in Trump 1. This time, he had a great relationship with the political appointees, but when DOGE came in, it was not right-sizing. It was devastating. And I realize that's a much larger agency. PHMSA is much smaller, but I'm just curious about how productive that relationship or unproductive that relationship was, whether they seemed to want to care about what your agency was all about, what safety, or was it just, cut. Any guidance on that would be appreciated.
Well, earlier this year, I was actually transitioning away from PHMSA as, the administration was winding up. And but I can say generally, I think, one, the agency is relatively small and lean. And I would say that I think, I have friends there, I have colleagues, I have, just an incredible group. And I think people that have looked at the agency are impressed with the mission. It's truly the most important agency in the federal government you never heard of. And I think, it was lean. I think the agency did a good job of probably justifying what they do. So I don't see a huge impact having happened at the agency by that effort. That, is really designed, it's brought in for, the whole of government. There was I don't really have a comment one way or another on that, but it's brought in to improve efficiency. That was the intent. But, PHMSA was already lean. So, and therefore I think, that I took advantage of the deferred resignation program. A few others did. And I think that probably satisfied the need to, address any sort of staffing issues. And like I said yesterday, PHMSA is hiring. In fact, if you want to be a part of the solution, please consider a job at PHMSA. I would say it's a great place, and I would have never been able to do what I did had I not joined PHMSA back in 2006. I mean, I was in a gas company, worked for different gas companies for 24 years, but when I joined PHMSA, I was shipped off to Alaska, and I never would have done that at a local distribution company. Now, I'm grateful for that experience too, because it gave me a lot of background for what I did at PHMSA, but it's just a great group of professionals, and I think that members of the public can take comfort in the fact that there's still a lot of really good people there.
I didn't plant the Alaska comment. Go ahead.
Can I add a quick addition to that answer real quick?
Yes. Okay.
I just want to note a couple of things. So I generally agree that I think PHMSA sort of got off without a lot of impact from the initial DOGE onslaught. There were other areas in the government that there was some more focus on. They may have just sort of been under the radar, but also already had quite a bit of a very lean operation that didn't sort of attract the same level of attention. But there are some initiatives that were started through that process, separate from the just culling programs piece, that I think is still worth being sort of on the lookout for what it may mean down the line. And in particular, I'll just, how they approach rulemaking in the future. There's a lot of initiatives that were started with the DOGE effort. One that I'm kind of looking out for is this idea that they're going to use AI to identify deregulatory opportunities. What does that actually mean? Does that mean they're going to sort of have some tool go through and say these lines of code need to be pulled out? Or is it going to mean we're going to identify potentially rules that you could undo and that should go through the regular process, et cetera, in a more meaningful way? I don't know yet. And I think there's still some things to look out for there, while I do agree that I think PHMSA largely sort of got away unscathed from the initial onslaught. Do you have a comment?
Yeah, just insofar as, industry has been attempting to be helpful in this process, right? We've absolutely been advocating for PHMSA to have more subject matter experts in the budget to do so and to make sure that those safety initiatives are happening. And they probably will go through the regular process. I cannot imagine all of that wonderful staff of the Standards and Rulemaking Committee. I cannot imagine them they probably would have a lot to say about just handing over an AI process to go through a rulemaking. I'm sure they still want to use their brains and go through the regulatory process.
Over here.
Okay, so coming from the realm that we're all in this place of there should be now no impact to public safety, but from the public perspective, and while we wait for some of the mandated rules to go through, now there's these advanced notices of proposed rulemakings. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on the burden of those proposed rulemakings to the public to try to keep up and to make comments on those, and also the burden that it places on the states when we're looking to, Colorado might be able to do this, and Colorado might be able to put in the advanced leak detection rules, but that's a burden to many states. It's a burden to the residents living there, and it also creates a patchwork of regulations, which is so often what the industry does not like. So I'd love to hear some thoughts on that.
Ashley?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. As somebody who's had to go through the Federal Register and respond to all of those, it has been quite a lot. I hope they don't do a big deluge again if anyone's listening. It is a lot. It's a lot of burden. I understand that on everyone to kind of go through those. I think too, it's been still an opportunity that everyone should still be commenting on, even if it's not to the level of your own expertise or perfection, right? It still provides an opportunity for the public to comment. And as someone who was on the Standards and Rulemaking team we look at every single comment, right? We read it. And even if it's, we have an understanding, or when I was there, we had an understanding that, the public wasn't going to have access to the same resources as they do on the industry side. So they would still take that comment into consideration and weigh it very seriously.
And maybe Dave, you can talk about how the deluge affects the states.
Yeah, I would say very similar comments. It's a lot. Definitely states are, communicating, talking about the rules and potential changes and, what impacts states. And yes, there is definitely differences from state to state, acknowledging that. But there's certainly discussion between the states about best paths forward. And then also, in addition to that, during those discussions, we look to each other to see what others have done in certain situations and try to, work on the past of other states and the benefits of other states and their work, and certainly use their rules to help, develop and, pass additional rules in our states as we see necessary. So certainly it's easier collectively as an organization, and so that's why we typically, as NAPSR, file comments collectively. And then any state that has any specific issues, they're also welcome to, file their own comments. But agree with the other comments. It is a lot of work to be looking at and staying on top of all of the regulatory activity.
And from a public interest group perspective, I think this is a big concern for us, and one of the things that larger groups like ours are really trying to make sure that we're tracking as much as we can, so that some perspective is in there, whether or not all the individuals who would normally engage would be able to do so. But even for us, that's hard. And there's a couple, there's things, so we're picking and choosing what we are able to comment on. Some of the AMPRM, so for the LNG facilities rule has been brought up a couple of times. That also allows us an opportunity to kind of see what the agency's thinking a little bit. While there's some good, the basic standards update and getting up to date with, current sort of industry practice is a good thing there. It also sort of illuminated some potential concerns around where they're going with the rulemaking that, we can now move forward with thinking about how to respond to. That AMPRM did not reflect what the statutory mandate says. It was sort of had a very narrow focus. So I think we will have new opportunities because they are, in some of these cases, doing AMPRMs. If people didn't get involved in that round, they'll have another opportunity to do so. But hopefully enough of us have engaged to provide some additional thought to the agency as they're moving forward and raise issues that may otherwise have been missed.
I just wanted to also put a plug in for the Pipeline Safety Trust as a good clearinghouse for the public that may find looking at the Federal Register daunting, but the Pipeline Safety Trust does an incredible job of keeping track of every breath PHMSA takes. So it's a good resource using their website. And also there's a dialogue between the agency and the trust on occasion. So, feel free to lean on them. I'm sure Bill doesn't mind me saying that.
Well, we'll end with that. And thanks so much to the presenters and to the audience for your good questions. And we have a break and coming back at 11.